the story we have undermines the story of evil. The devil's narrative that's been inserted into culture time and time again, the narrative of weaponized accusation, the narrative of scapegoating, the narrative of mobs, the narrative of violence, and that through the application of those things you can accomplish great things, even good things. But all that does is it turns us into Satan. It upends creation, it upends society, it upends civilization. And we fall for that temptation all the time. That's a contrary narrative. That's a contrary story. The gospel then is able to subvert that and propose a different narrative of human existence. And if we go back to the beginning, it's a narrative that's able to deal with horror.
Welcome to the Word on Fire Institute. I'm Andrew Petiprin, Fellow of Popular Culture, and I'm joined today by the CEO of Word on Fire Catholic Ministries, Father Steve Grunow, who is joining me to talk about the horror genre and why it matters. Father Steve, thanks for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Andrew. I appreciate the invite, and I guess you chose the most terrifying member of the Word on Fire team to tackle this issue.
Well, one of the most important things in any guest is expertise, and I know that you have a great deal of expertise on the horror genre, so you were the natural choice. Thank you.
And in frightening people.
Well, we'll let our audience decide that. Well, as we think about the horror genre, I thought it might be good to start off with, before we talk about what it is and why it matters, maybe a quote to kind of get us started thinking about kind of priming the pump. I have a little quote for you from H.P. Lovecraft, who is a controversial figure, to be sure, definitely somebody who said some really unfortunate things in his life, but he is also an extremely influential figure in the horror genre. And he said in an essay that he wrote called Supernatural Horror in Literature, he said this: "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. These facts few psychologists will dispute, and their admitted truth must establish for all time the genuineness and dignity of the weirdly horrible tale as a literary form." What do you make of H.P. Lovecraft's quote there? And maybe we could get into where the horror genre comes from. Why is it something that still has staying power today?
You know, I would agree with a lot in Lovecraft's kind of assessment or definition, except for that it's the most primordial dimension of human experience. I do think that there is something that is prior to fear, but just to give him credit, I think he's named the significance of the genre and its staying power, because what horror is doing, it's the evocation of terror, and what are we terrified of? We're terrified of what we're afraid of. And that what we're afraid of can be conscious or unconscious, but nevertheless, the emotion is so strong that it demands articulation. It demands presentation. And through that articulation and presentation, we learn something about ourselves.
So he continues in the quote to say this: "The weird tale has survived, developed, and attained remarkable heights of perfection." Now, that means it's come from somewhere. We have these tales today, but we've always had these tales, haven't we? What are some of the kind of the earliest ones that you can think of, like in some of the earliest expressions of art and literature and culture?
Well, you know, if you go back to the mythological imagination, just consider some of the origins myths in which the cosmos is constituted by the battles of monsters, of ancient beasts, and their creation and their destruction. Or if you go to the Olympian pantheon and the transition from the Titans to the Olympians, how does that begin? It begins with the horror of a father consuming his own children. So, you know, those types of evocations are dark, yes, and they're also ancient.
Yeah. And, it seems, we have these figures, too, that pop up in some of the classic tales. Like we have Grendel in Beowulf. We have fairy tale traditions that have all kinds of scary things in them. And then we have, maybe in the 19th century, things take on a shape that's more recognizable to us today in Edgar Allan Poe and Mary Shelley and people like that. And a lot of those things have been made into films and have a lot of staying power. And it seems to me that the thing that we find all throughout, and even down to today, is the idea of the monster, as you said. And I wonder if you could just explain to us, like, the different categories of monster. What do we look at in different kinds of horror tales?
Well, the monster is an interesting kind of genre in and of itself, and it's archetypal. So what does it represent as an archetype? It can represent something that's supernatural, and it can also represent something that is natural. So a supernatural monster is something that is coming from outside of our experience and outside of our world. It's breaking into it. Whereas the natural is kind of the breaking out of certain dynamics of the human condition into the world. Those dynamics can be the unfamiliar, the unknown, the violent. Those are things that come out of humanity, and they affect the world and they affect other human beings in manifold ways. So that's the kind of natural monster. The supernatural monster is another category in and of itself, and it can represent the inbreaking of our terrors in the face of the cosmos itself. Our terrors in the face of the gods or God, something that is otherworldly.
I want to get into specific horror tales and things, but maybe just as a start, could you give us some examples of some supernatural monsters and then maybe some natural monsters, ones that our audience might have heard of before?
Well, if you think of the great kind of beasts of ancient mythology, those oftentimes represent the inbreaking of a being or a creature into our world, into our realm of experience. So those would be examples. Even you mentioned Beowulf with Grendel. So that, to me, is an example of a supernatural monster. Then you have natural monsters where I'm going to I'll play with something now, but we would immediately probably think of something like Frankenstein's monster as being, but that's where we get it wrong. Frankenstein's monster is a natural monster. He's made of human pieces. But as that story develops, you come to understand he's not the real monster, or at least the only monster in the tale. The actual monsters in the tale are the human beings that surround the monster.
Yeah, let's get into that for a little bit since you brought it up. Now, we see in Frankenstein, for example, the idea that it really is Dr. Frankenstein. It is the creator of the monster who is, in a very real sense, the real monster of the story. But then we also have the one who looks like the monster and who, in a sense, allows himself to become the identity that is put upon him. Is that something that we see pretty often in these horror tales? And maybe what does that mean to us?
Well, Frankenstein is an interesting thing because he's put together from the parts of dead bodies. That means from other people, and he's just thrown into existence against his own will. And so, like, what is he? He's waiting for his creator to kind of reveal that to him, but he doesn't know. And so he just simply imitates the behaviors of the people around him, and in their resistance to him because his appearance is hideous, he just takes on those qualities that the human beings around him throw at him. And so in the terms of the making of the monster, how is he made? Well, his creator made him monstrous. His interactions with other people make him monstrous. So that's one of the great lessons of that particular horror tale.
And it's one of the reasons I think it continues to be one of the most important tales, and one that will just continue to be retold over and over again. Just recently, there was a new series starring Sean Bean that explored yet again the Frankenstein story, I think, to great effect. When we think about especially horror movies, Now, it certainly is the case with the books as well, but with the visual element, it really brings in a whole new way of thinking about the horror genre. And Stephen King talks about 3 different types of horror. And I think that we see these different types sometimes all together in one film, but oftentimes we see them in isolation as well. And these are the 3 types. I'd love for you to say something maybe about the significance of these. He says that, first of all, there's the gross out or the revolting horror film. That there's just, it's that kind of thing where you just see a severed head or you just see something gross and you physically recoil from it.
Yeah.
So that's one type. He then says that there's horror proper. He uses the term horror for the second kind. And about that, he says that this is the unnatural. He uses the example of spiders the size of beasts, or bears, the dead waking up and walking around. That when the lights go out and something with claws grabs you by the arm. That's what he calls horror. But then the third one, he says, is terror. That's the third level. And this is where things, I think, reach a kind of deep psychological and spiritual sense. He says, when you come home and notice everything you own has been taken away and replaced by an exact substitute, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So what do you think about those 3 categories?
Okay, so the first category is just the gross out thing, correct? I think that's our fear of our own corporeality, that our bodies are gross. And you consider like what's going on inside of you all the time. And if that was pulled back, what does it look like? And is that me? Is that me? And so when you have these kind of incidents of horror that are presented in literature or in film especially, that just show you something that's disgusting, it's really a coming to terms of the fears related to our own corporeality. Now, what was the second one again? Refresh my memory so I get it right.
The second one, Stephen King calls horror. He just calls that one horror. And he talks about that as the unnatural, like, giant spiders or the dead waking up, like that sort of thing.
That's our fear that the world in which we inhabit is ultimately out of our control. And it's out of control, that the natural world is not just ours to kind of command. So we imagine the possibility of a spider that's as large as a bear, but we know that there is that possibility in nature to produce a spider as large as a bear, and that spider would turn on us. So that it's our discomfort with our lack of control over the natural world that makes us construct monsters in our minds and then have to kind of deal with that fear that way. Now, the next one, if I'm recollecting correctly, is terror.
That's right.
And again, I think that that's an issue of control as well, but it's more about our psychological control, the fear of madness, that, the order of our rationality, by which that we either impose on the world or that kind of is the manner in which the world greets us, somehow that falls away. And then where are we? So in that last one of terror, it's a psychological kind of coming to terms with madness. So
right.
He's got really great categories there. And as you said, the juxtaposition of all 3 is present in a lot of contemporary kind of tales of horror.
I wonder on that note if we could back up for a second and think maybe theologically for a second, because when we think about the world that we inhabit now, and we look all the way back to our origin story, our pre-fall kind of destiny, as it were, we can think the world isn't supposed to be gross and horrible and terrible, right? That we're made for something different. And so I'm just wondering kind of theologically, when you watch a horror movie and you see something gross and horrible and terrible, what does it mean to you theologically, just even in your work in ministry and evangelism? Well,
in terms of, I'm going to take it back to what that means, which means it's our dealing with our corporeality. And our corporeality is given as it is in a fallen world. So we might imagine in our minds a world in which it is different, or extend our imagination to heavenly realities that seem to be immunized against the reality of our corporeality. But nevertheless, it's a given in our world. The coming to terms with that, for me, is the incarnation of God in Christ. So let's take that seriously for what it is. God assumes a human nature and lives a real human life. And that means he experiences for himself human corporeality. So gestation, birth, growth, and all the things that are associated with the operations of a human body. All those things he accepts. And if there was even some exemption because he's not held bound himself by sin, he experiences it in his encounter with others. So it's no longer a God who's presented at a distance from those realities, but immerses himself into those things. And then he goes into the greatest terror and horror that we have, which is not just death itself, but torturous death, in which the corporeal aspect of existence is harmed in a terrifying way that leads to death. All these things God does when he unites his divine nature with the human nature in Christ. So the theological kind of resolution of the terror at our corporeality is the incarnation. It isn't kind of to fall into kind of a pseudo-Platonism in which we just kind of rarefy ourselves out of this existence in the anticipation of being released from our bodies, or that there's a kind of world of forms that used to be, but we've lost it. No, it's just, this is what God does. This is how God brings this reality, this frightening aspect of our existence. This is how he resolves it, by entering into it himself.
Yeah, that seems really well said. And, I sometimes think about in certain instances, certain stories from the Gospels where, Jesus lives, as you say, these very real things just as we do, including, something like the raising of Lazarus, which is, something that he does. But in a sense, it must have looked a little like a horror movie, really. I mean, this man emerging, not resurrected, but reanimated, as it were, from the grave.
Well, that has all the dimensions of a tale of terror, because it's death, and it's fear of death, and it's the encounter with decomposition. It's a body, and then the terror that overtakes people at a power that is so great that it can bring the dead back to life. I mean, I think at times we domesticate these stories in the Bible or in the Gospels, and we would cringe if anyone was to say, that's terrifying. But the reality of it is, if you kind of try to project yourself through your imagination into that story, how could you say, I wouldn't be afraid? You'd be terrified. And then also you can understand the adverse reaction. So powerful people hear of a person who can raise the dead. That overturns all worldly expectations. And the aversion to that is, if this guy can raise the dead, what else can he do? And he certainly can do more than us. And then you begin to understand the conniving and the scheming to get rid of him. So, yeah, I think that's an example of a terrifying story in the gospel.
Do you think on that note that it's therefore good for us to kind of be exposed, at least from time to time, to things that terrify us? I mean, to watch a horror movie, for example, as a reminder of the incarnation, of the resurrection, all of that sort of thing.
Well, I guess you're postulating, can horror be used as a spiritual exercise? And I'd have to give that some thought, because it wouldn't be something that I would just recommend to everyone. A lot of the terrors of life interrupt us naturally. So we face limitations in terms of our own bodies. We face psychological terrors. We face even the fear of the monstrous in our lives. Those things just happen. The benefit to horror is that it can be preparation to deal with the emotions that arise because of those experiences. But it can't be the only story that we hear. And what you're asking is so people could make a relationship between the horror genre and these truths of the Christian faith. I think you'd need a mentor or a spiritual guide to help you to do it. I don't think that most Christians that would arrive naturally for them. In fact, I've just encountered in most Christians and most Catholics an aversion to horror as a genre in literature and film, because it's just seen as something so dark that it must be associated with the malevolent, spiritually malevolent or evil, rather than this is an exercise in human nature, in human knowing, in a coming to terms with realities that are deeply human and that we're inextricably linked to.
And if I'm hearing you correctly, though, it sounds like you're saying, just from a pastoral perspective, you certainly wouldn't encourage everybody to watch every horror movie, but it also sounds like you're saying, watching a horror movie, I guess depending on the type, isn't necessarily, or in fact, it isn't at all, from case to case, participating in evil, for example.
No, and for some people, it might be a good thing. It might be the way in which they come to terms with these realities of human experience. For others, no, it would not be a good thing, because they would not have the capacity to understand or to be able to deal with the emotions those realities would evoke in them. So again, it's the case-by-case basis. What would be ideal if, in terms of pastoral care, if leaders in the church, teachers, priests, religious, that they were able to have a comprehension of these dimensions of human experience that are terrifying, know that through the centuries they've been articulated in story and more recently in visual storytelling, and how can these things be useful? How can these things be routes of access? And then how do you discern carefully who can actually utilize these things helpfully and those who cannot? So I do think that in terms of pastoral leadership, they need to be aware of this as a dimension of human experience and as a dimension of human creativity.
Yeah, that's a helpful distinction. I appreciate that, Father. Let's get into some specific movies and stories, maybe, and get your take on kind of what their significance is for us in the spiritual life. Mm-hmm. How about a classic like The Wolfman? What's your take on The Wolfman?
Well, the Wolfman is a kind of classic juxtaposition of the animal and the man. And what that is showing us is these animalistic tendencies, they inhere in our humanity. So what you see the Wolfman become, that's kind of taking some internal reality and externalizing it. And that's what we're afraid. We know there's these animalistic tendencies in us. We know that there's a connectivity between ourselves and the rest of the natural world, which is at times uncontrollable. And our humanity kind of keeps it in check. But what would happen if suddenly that capacity to keep the animalistic in us, it didn't work anymore? And then you have the Wolfman. And you have the terror of the person becoming the animal, and then the terror of everyone around them. But when we have human beings who act in animalistic ways, it's the same terror. It's just not the Wolfman as conceived of in fiction, in literature, and film, but it's the same effect.
Something I always find interesting about the Wolfman, obviously, is his sort of coming out as the wolf is linked to the fullness of the moon. But the significance of that, to me, it seems to be, is it doesn't happen all the time, right? Yeah. It's there are those moments in our lives, right, when these things can happen.
Right, and also it's not within his power to control it.
Right.
So like the moon is going to come out whether he likes it or not. And the moon's going to come out even if it's hidden by the clouds. It's like you're going to become an animal at some point, and you're living in terror and dread of that happening because the rest of the time you're human. The rest of the time the control is there. And then suddenly it's unleashed. Then what? It's a nightmare for you, and it's a nightmare for everybody around you. So there it is. I mean, there's the three qualities that Stephen King talks about. They're all present in that story.
Would you say, too, that the Wolfman, not to dwell for too long on the Wolfman, but would you say, too, that we also find there's something of the natural and the supernatural monster together, or would that just be a natural monster?
Well, in some of the films, there is a kind of presentation of religion in relation to the Wolfman that acts as a kind of control, and when that control of religion is lost, the Wolfman kind of emerges in the form of a curse. So I do remember one of the films in which the manifestation of the mark of the wolf is revealed at the time of the child's baptism. So
Interesting.
it's seen as difficult. And I don't know if people really have ever internalized this, but we think of the silver bullet. This is the silver bullet, and that's going to kill him. And there's association of silver with the moon and things like that. So it's kind of like in order to destroy something, you've got to use the same power that creates it. But in a lot of the legends, the silver bullet is made of a holy object. So a blessed metal or a crucifix is melted down, and that's what kills the Wolfman. Now, the tragedy of that is in killing the Wolfman, you also kill the man. And that's also signaling to us that within us, there's this animal reality, and you can't kill it without killing ourselves. So
That's very interesting. How about shifting gears to something rather different? I just recently rewatched the film The Shining, based on Stephen King's novel. That is a very, very terrifying film, in my opinion. What is your take on The Shining?
It's terrifying because it's about a reality that is been a part of human culture for some time, but it's not a supernatural terror, it's a natural one, and it's about alcoholism. And all the manifestations of terrifying things in that movie and all the reactions of the people in the movie are a reaction to what alcoholism does to a person and to a family. So that's what's happening in that movie, and I think that even if that's not consciously at the surface of our understanding of the movie, it's unconsciously there. And anyone who's lived in the dysfunctional families of alcoholics would recognize that film for what it is, in which it's an extensive, terrifying commentary on the destruction of a man and his family because of alcohol.
I wonder how many people will hear you say that and go back and watch The Shining and see that for the first time. Because I have to admit, I knew about of course, it's very clear in the film that he had been a drinker and he quit, and there's a motif, a sad part of the story that he had apparently abused his son and that sort of thing. But the first few times that I saw the movie, it didn't really occur to me that really it was about the alcoholism.
Right, and the whole construct of it is his regression back into the alcoholic state, from the movement into the hotel to the confining experience of it, the accessibility of, he's at the bar, and even the hallucinations of everything. It's all related to that, and then it's ultimately something that's destructive. So, the terrifying, the monstrous doesn't have to be supernatural. At times it's natural. And
right.
To me, the power of that story is that this is really a natural terror.
I think that's a very interesting take. I really appreciate that. One of my favorite types of horror movies, and you may differ, but I really enjoy zombie movies, and I enjoy movies that have a kind of apocalyptic or dystopian sort of feel to them. Where does that come from? What is your take on that particular flavor of horror movie?
It's our fear at the relentlessness of death, that death is unrelenting in its power, and it's all around us all the time. And so the zombie, especially when you have the mass horde of zombies, it just represents that the death is on our heels, and we're going to try to escape it, and we're trying to fight it off, but ultimately it's of such force that it will overcome us. It's just a matter of time. But that's a reason that it's not my favorite genre, because I think it's easily resolvable. It's not like when they, for example, like the Walking Dead things. I lost interest in a couple seasons, because I was just like, yes, 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 death is all around us. Death is coming. Yes, yes, yes. And it's just hitting that home constantly. And to me, it just became unoriginal at a certain point. So that's not my favorite genre, but it's about death. But you also have Stephen King's three dimensions in there too, because the decay of our bodies is something that frightens us. That our bodies could fall apart, loss of control. The zombie is you, but it's not you, and what is it? And it's out of control, things like that. And then what did this? Is it natural? Is it supernatural? How can it be resolved? Is it the divine apocalypse? Is it a human apocalypse? We don't know. So you have those three dimensions present in that, and that accounts for its popular appeal, I think.
Well, I appreciate your commenting on it, even though it's not your favorite, because it is pretty popular. It is pretty much in the water still these days, although maybe things are winding down a little.
I'll give you another take on it. In just the zombie genre kind of reemerged fairly recently, and I do think that there is a dimension of alienation from others. It's the other as a threat. So that people have begun to see other people as a threat to themselves. And I would say that you can. It's a result of the hyper-individualism of our culture. And so that if the individual is everything, the choices of the individual, the security of the individual, the rights of the individual, all those things, then pressing against it is the horde of humanity. And it has to be held at bay constantly. And as our society has kind of really been grasped and taken in by almost an excessive individualism, the zombie genre has taken on a different meaning, that it's not just death, it's everybody else that I'm afraid of. And they're all monsters and I don't want to become like them. I want to be me, and I want to be making my choices, and this is the people that I choose to be with, and this and that and stuff. And then the horde is pressing upon me. So I do think that there's that's going on that also accounts for its popular appeal. It's an imaginative working out of the darker implications of our own individualism.
How about some of the really gross, gory stuff, the kind of stuff that I would never recommend to anybody? But there was a period there, even just a few years ago, where there were a lot of these just really, borderline pornographic gore fest movies, like the Saw movies and Hostel and things like that.
Right.
Why do we have those movies?
Because our bodies are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to change, they're vulnerable to destruction, they're vulnerable to pain, they're vulnerable to death. And so as such, the idea that our body could be compromised in some way against our will is absolutely terrifying to us. Or it could be modified in some way against our will is just terrifying. And it's our fear of the kind of interruption of our experience by the failure of our own bodies. So our bodies we're really dependent upon them. And we oftentimes, it's at the unconscious level that our dependence on our body is just kind of being worked out. But, your body is just running all the time by itself. You don't have to think about digestion. You don't have to think about circulation. You don't have to think about any of those things. It's just happening. But then if your mind turns towards that, it's like this is this system that is extremely delicate and not really in my control all the time. It could be interrupted. It could be broken. It could stop. And then what do I become as a result of that? So in a lot of these movies in which the human body is compromised or maimed or something like that, the terror in that is a terror at the loss of control of our own body. And it's a very dark form of horror. You're right, and a lot of it falls really into the category of the pornographic. We shouldn't be looking at that. We should look away from it. We should stop that story from being told, because too much of an encounter with the vulnerability of our own bodies, it drives us mad.
How about these kind of campier teen type horror movies that almost play out as kind of morality tales? What about those?
Yeah, at times I think they're almost closer to like cautionary tales or fairy tales. And it's just like, okay, it's like the Hansel and Gretel story being told, but they've been placed in adolescence. And so what are the terrors that you face in adolescence? And it's like you go out into the world and it's very, very dangerous. And then you experiment and you do certain things that are forbidden to you. Either they were forbidden because you didn't know about them when you were young, or there's the social constraint that says you can't do certain things, and you go and do it. And yet the thing is, the reason those things are qualified or held back from you or forbidden is because they're potentially dangerous. And so when there's the inbreaking of danger after there's the transgression, it's like, well, this version of Hansel and Gretel, they didn't deal very well with the witch. You know, they ended up, the witch got them. And that's the monster or whatever. But really, the monster is just the vicissitudes of life. It's the problems of being human. It's taking on too much too soon. All those types of things that end up subverting us or harming us in some way.
Yeah. All right, last one, and then I want to shift gears. Is The Wizard of Oz a horror movie?
Yes, it is. And one of the greatest experiences I had when I was studying film in college was we did the classic monsters. So we did the classic horror monsters, the Universal films of Dracula, the Wolfman, and Frankenstein. And then the instructor surprised everyone by saying, now I'm going to introduce you to one of the greatest classic horror films of all time. And then she rolled the film, and it was The Wizard of Oz. And everybody broke into laughter. And then she's just, wait. You're just going to have to watch this, but you're going to have to watch it with different eyes. That this is not just a charming children's tale. This is a tale of terror. That everything that is happening in this movie is deeply frightening. And even the things that are seemingly innocuous and friendly, they're twisted and distorted and strange. And her great insight was one of the Hollywood's greatest cinematic monsters was the Wicked Witch of the West. And she asked for a show of hands of how many of you as a child, when that witch first appeared, were you utterly and completely terrified? And all the hands went up. That for some related the story that they had to leave the room. They couldn't handle it. But that figure of the Wicked Witch is an absolute monster. And so you have a monster movie in a manner or a genre that we least expect to find it.
I wonder how many of our viewers will have ever thought about The Wizard of Oz as a horror movie.
Well, they should think about it differently now.
They absolutely should. And I think that when they hear what you've just said, a light bulb will go off in their heads because, of course, it's a horror movie. The Wicked Witch of the West, as you say, is just truly one of the most terrifying characters in movie history.
Or as an exercise, take Stephen King's 3 things, and they apply in that movie.
Absolutely.
It's a very scary movie.
I agree. Well, let's shift gears maybe to a more spiritual side here. As a priest, you're, I think, uniquely suited when we talk about horror movies to maybe address some of the occult stuff and the demonic and the diabolical that we see in some of the classic horror stories and horror films. Maybe let's start with the devil himself. How is he depicted in horror movies and horror stories versus maybe the way that Christians actually ought to think about him?
That's really a complicated story, and I'll try to do my best with it. And so I'm going to ask for the patience of the viewers of this, and I just hope that I'm able to articulate in a way that everybody can understand. I think that most cinematic presentations of the devil are diffusive. They're putting up special effects, and it obscures the actual reality of how the devil influences the world and influences individuals. In a sense, they distract us from that because it focuses on things like special effects and being startled. And then mixes the genre with other types of experiences of the monstrous that are natural rather than supernatural. And so we lose a sense of how the devil kind of really interacts with our world. And it's, to me, the example of that is, why is it that the devil has such control over electronic devices? Like, why is there always an interruption of the lights and things like that? And it's like, I suppose you have an angelic intelligence and he can affect reality in ways that would startle and frighten us. But is that really the way that he's influencing the human condition? To scare us with his power over electricity? To me, it's a distraction. And so the presentation of the devil in film is oftentimes problematic that way. Now, that's not to say that some people haven't really got it. And I think that the telling of the visual storytelling of William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist, it is a presentation of how the devil kind of interacts with our reality and what he intends to do, which is a point that's oftentimes missed when people watch that movie because it's so well done and well crafted. They become terrified at elements of it that isn't the real terror. The real terror is there that the devil wants to convince us that we're no better than animals. And once he's convinced us of that, then that's how we're going to act. And so there's this fundamental resistance between the spiritual authorities in that movie that are trying to seize back from the devil's control this girl who's being transformed before their eyes into a mere animal. Something that is just being used and moved along against her will. And the thing is, so they've got to pull that back so that power does not manifest itself to the world. So it's a deep presentation of what the devil really intends to do, rather than he's just there to startle us, or he's just there to frighten us, or something like that.
Let me read a quote from you, actually,
Okay.
from an article that you wrote several years ago when there was a short-lived, I think, Exorcism TV show that came back, and you had some problems with it. Let me just read a sentence to you to kind of further this along. You said, "Exorcism has become not just an official rite of the church, but it is a kind of literary and cinematic genre. Unleashed from the church's doctrines and muddled by a lack of metaphysical clarity, the idea of exorcism has drifted into the absurd, having as much to do with the reality referenced by the church's rite as when the devil is presented as a costumed character clothed in a red union suit brandishing a pitchfork." So that just leads me to ask you, about not only about the depiction of the devil, but about the church, the depiction of the church and the church's ministry to people who are, in a sense, involved in this spiritual warfare that the rest of the world can't see. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that, the way the church is depicted.
I think that at times it's depicted as if priests are shamans that have magical powers. And one of our magical powers is that we can pull demons out of people by our own will and our own efforts because we're, as I said, we're a shaman, and that's what we're doing. But that isn't the church's understanding of what an exorcism is or the power of the church's minister in relation to it. And really, an exorcism is an act of healing. That a person has become compromised in body and soul, and there's a soul sickness there that has made them vulnerable to powers that are beyond our capacity to fully understand or control. And the role of the church's minister in that is a healing ministry, but the healing that the exorcist unleashes is the healing power of Christ. So what you see manifested in exorcism itself is not magical. It's the power of God in Christ who accepts a human nature, lives a real human life, and encounters our bondage to dark spiritual powers. And he has the power to liberate us from those things. And so it's a calling forth of his power to heal the human condition when it's compromised in this terrifying way.
And how do you think in the original Exorcist movie that many people have seen, how do you think that they got it right, maybe, in that one, or depicted it better?
By presenting the frailty of the church's ministers in there. So, and the thing is that when the younger priest is getting it wrong, it's because he thinks that through an act of his own will, he can kind of accomplish this thing. And the older priest, who's very frail himself physically, knows that that's not the case. And if I can, for those who haven't seen it, but what ends up affecting the healing in the situation is an act of self-sacrificial love. And so the younger priest has to become a complete embodiment of what Christ does to heal. what Christ does to oppose the dark powers. He has to become himself a self-sacrifice of love, and that's what undoes the devil's doing. Now, that we're not in shamanistic magic in that when you're looking at it from that perspective.
Yeah, I think that's pretty helpful. And I have to say, though, that movie is so terrifying to me that I'm not sure I'm going to go back and watch it to see that your point is proved. But I appreciate your analysis very much. I'm sure many people will as well. What about the way the power of the church or the power of our faith is depicted in things like vampire stories, like the Dracula story? We haven't talked about Dracula yet, but it seems to me the role of the church, and this builds upon what you were just saying about the role of the exorcist in The Exorcist. The church and the power of the gospel, the power of our faith, is, if you're looking closely at a lot of vampire stories and a lot of Dracula tales, is very much on offer. You don't have the antidote to this darkness is the light. It seems to me. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, Bram Stoker's Dracula is a deeply Catholic novel, in which that it's a dark spiritual power that has to be opposed by the church. That the only recourse people have is to the church. That the church has what they need to defeat the vampire. And so they turn to Abraham Van Helsing, who's a scientist, but more importantly than a scientist, he's a man of faith, and not just any faith, but the Catholic faith. And so what he's doing is he's applying kind of the healing salve of the church's sacramentals to this disruptive and awful situation. So what is kind of ends up keeping Dracula in check or diminishing his power is recourse to the sacramentals of the church. So that's his undoing. That's the undoing of Dracula, is the church undoes him, acting through these causes, but acting through a man of faith. So it isn't until the man of faith enters the scene that there's going to be any resolution to the conflict there. Now, if the thing is, that's not always the case when they tell the story of the vampire. And as the vampire story has progressed, the view that the church has some power over this reality has been diminished. And that's notable in Stephen King's Salem's Lot, which is a truly terrifying book. But there's a priest who figures prominently in that book. His name is Father Callahan. Father Callahan is an alcoholic priest, and he finds himself in this terrible circumstance, and they're trying to deal with this vampiric infestation in the town. And ultimately, the vampire confronts him, and it basically challenges him to a battle of faith. And the priest falters, and he fails. And he ends up being compromised so that he's no longer useful, and he flees. But there's kind of a sense of tragedy and terror in that, because in the initial confrontation with the vampire, he did have the power. It was his own doubts that subverted that power. And so once that was lost, the battle became much more threatening and pressing. But where you have the kind of church brought into the Bram Stoker's Dracula to bring resolution, what King does is he takes the church out at a certain point. And I think he does that to raise the stakes of the terror.
I think that's interesting, because I think about a show that I enjoyed very much when it was on, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And I think about how the depiction of fighting against vampires and demons in that show is really built upon something like what you're saying is a shift that Stephen King and others maybe affected in the way the power of the church specifically works in relation to vampires. Because what you have in that show are people who we would call nuns, people who have no religion as far as we know, but who for whatever reason are put in this context where they're supposed to be fighting against evil. And they find that the church's sacramentals work, but they don't know what they're connected to. They never really sort of understand this like holistic this holistic vision of good versus evil. I don't know if you have more to say about that.
The thing is that if you notice the progression of that series as it goes along, the efficacy of the cross, of sacramentals, they're less at play. And there's the explanation of that is that she's kind of grown out of that. She doesn't need those things anymore. So it's like her will to power is enough to deal with it. So there's a kind of gesturing towards the vapors of Christianity at the beginning, but then it becomes an entirely Nietzschean drama. It's the triumph of will over the power of evil that is the ultimate message of the show. And at the very beginning, she had recourse to holy water and the cross and things like that, but it was never clearly explained as to why these things actually worked. That would have been a turn of the plot too close to religion, I think, for the creator of the show, and also I think that there's a less muddled metaphysic in Bram Stoker's Dracula than in a lot of the subsequent tellings of the vampire story. And so that there's a comprehensive metaphysic there, whereas that kind of fades. And in a way, it's the fading of the influence of the church on the culture that you're seeing. That once people are like, well, yeah, you can hold up a cross and the vampire go away, but then they begin to think, well, why does that even work? And they don't know. And it's the absence of the metaphysics of Christianity that deprives them of that reality. The other thing I'd say to that, too, is what you see in the genre is in at least if we start with Beowulf, which is in itself a Christian story in many respects, and I don't want to get too deep into that, but the thing is you have a sense in there that it's Christ versus the devil. It's Christ versus the devil. So you have the antagonist and protagonist very clear. Human actors are caught up in a larger kind of theodrama, to borrow a Balthasarian word. And then it kind of moves along, and as you move out of the Enlightenment, it's good versus evil. And what ends up happening is the horror genre is more good versus evil. You have a Manichaeism develop. That in the story of Christ and the devil, we know who's going to win every time. In if it just is good and evil and it's Manichaean, they're just kind of banging against one another all the time. And sometimes, good wins and sometimes evil wins, and then the struggle continues. Where it's at now, it seems to me, is you don't have Christ and the devil, you don't have good or evil. We're now beyond both of those. So all you have is antagonists and protagonists. That's it. And there's no metaphysic that supports it. It's just kind of this thrownness into kind of a horrifying existence. And so it's like, well, is there good or evil? I don't know. Which character is good and which character is evil? We don't know. They're all compromised. Is there some type of power that could assist in this? Where does the power come from? Well, I don't know. That even if a demon is presented, where's that from? Like, what does that have to do on how does that make any sense on a cosmological level or a theological level? Those aren't questions we ask anymore. It's just the protagonist and antagonist.
And this reminds me of a phenomenon that I find a little bit disturbing, and you've already kind of gone in this direction a little bit in your last answer there. But we have this whole convention now where we take what used to be the antagonist and turn them into the protagonist, right? So like we have the story Wicked, which takes the Wicked Witch of the West and makes her sort of, if we can just understand her story, then we'll understand that she's not really the bad guy. And then we end up sort of thinking of the people we used to think of as the good guys as the bad guys. Yeah. The same is the case with Maleficent, right? And so they're taking even some fairy tales and turning them around like that. And I think that really does speak to a culture that's pretty confused about, as you say, this sort of fundamental metaphysics. Right.
And also, if you look at the kind of recharacterization of Maleficent, you had in the Disney Sleeping Beauty a wonderful allegory of Christian baptism. You do. And Maleficent just represents the devil in that story. And it's about baptism and what baptism affects and the devil's resistance to that effects. and then how sin and death are correlated, and all these types of things, and there's virtue. And you notice that the climactic battle of that of Disney's Sleeping Beauty, the cross is on the shield. So the things, it's just overt that this is a Christian story, and so when then they take that character and they transpose it into our current kind of cultural situation. Well, Christianity has to be evacuated from it so it can have broad universal appeal. And you don't want to make this too Christian. In fact, let's not make it Christian at all. And then it becomes, well, then what is this thing? What is this Maleficent? And it's just, well, she's just this creature that's misunderstood and has her own hurt and her own pain. And that's an entirely different narrative than the previous telling. It's not the same story at all. It's something entirely different, and it's more about secularism as myth, secularism as narrative. It's about the evacuation of a Christian metaphysic from the culture.
Yeah, and at the risk of maybe sounding a little bit too cynical, but I'll go ahead and say it. I mean, it's almost the case then that all of the villains, all the old villains were just what were arbitrarily decided upon by these Christians who were sort of trying to impose something on all the rest of us. And now, these tales are being liberated in some way. I do wonder if they'll have any staying power, though. There's a reason that the old stories work. So we'll see, won't we?
Yeah, I think we have to see. I mean, we believe in the inevitable triumph of Christ through the power of his resurrection. And in as much as those older tellings are linked to that great story, the secularist construct doesn't win. And then we go back to, we have a more ancient understanding of what the real battle is. And it's not this kind of battle to become secular or to evacuate a space in culture from religion so human flourishing can develop as a result. That's a secularist myth. And ours is that the great battle is the battle for souls. And it's a battle that's been won. And there's a point in actual human history in which we know that battle has been won. And the role of the church is to constantly give testimony to that victory in the face of all these false narratives. And it's not to say that those narratives can't be interesting or they can't say something. I mean, if we go back to the Maleficent thing, it's telling a truth about the culture. Now, it's not an ultimate truth in which Christians would believe, but nevertheless, a truth about the culture is being revealed. What's our response to that? It's to hold up again this genuine historical event in which the power of evil was defeated. And you take the three terrors of Stephen King, and those three terrors were defeated in the resurrection of Christ from the dead. So it's like, there you have it. Like, that's our response. So if we're making it an act of faith in the enduring power of the Christian story in the face of these deformations or reconfigurations.
Father Steve, in the few minutes that remain for us, what are some horror movies or stories that we haven't talked about yet that are some of your favorites?
Oh, geez. I always find that hard because it's hard for me to prioritize films in that way. Like, this is my favorite. A horror film that stands out, and I've already mentioned it, is The Exorcist. I think that's one of the most well-done horror movies of all time. The original Universal movies, we think of them as campy and ridiculous, but they're archetypal. And I just think that's why they're important. I also think that a lot of contemporary fiction and film is horrific without acknowledging that fact, that what they're telling us about humanity, about human relationships, of human interaction with the world, is desperate and it's made desperate by the evacuation of the Christian metaphysic. So it's kind of like that. We're so filled with existential dread at the cultural presentation that life is basically meaningless, and we have to impose meaning upon it, even if that means violent imposition. And a lot of our narratives are precisely that. And I think that's terrifying. So it's maybe, if you're going to tell me what's really scary right now, it's the new narrative, which is that we have to kind of make meaning, impose it on our own existence and the existence of others. And that ultimately just gives rise to violence. And then it's inescapable, and it's inescapable.
And I'm guessing, Father Steve, that as the head of an evangelistic organization, you would say it's our job as Christians and Catholics to articulate something else.
Well, our revelation is embedded in narratives. It's embedded in stories about what the Lord Jesus did and what he accomplished. And it's not those things are not presented to us as modern historiography or biography, but there's expressed as testimony to what people saw, and then they're embedded in these stories. And so in a sense, humans are telling these stories all the time. They're going to tell those stories in literature, in art, and most recently in visual mediums like film and television and stuff like that. They're telling stories all the time. We have the master narrative. We have the story that interprets all the other stories. We have the story that positions all the other stories. We have the story that makes sense of all the stories that are being told. And that's not an arrogant thing to say, because we didn't construct it. We didn't create it. And we also believe that the story we have undermines the story of evil. The devil's narrative that's been inserted into culture time and time again. The narrative of weaponized accusation, the narrative of scapegoating, the narrative of mobs, the narrative of violence, and that through the application of those things you can accomplish great things. Oh, even good things. But all that does is it turns us into Satan. It upends creation. It upends society. It upends civilization. And we fall for that temptation all the time. That's a contrary narrative. That's a contrary story. The gospel then is able to subvert that and propose a different narrative of human existence. And if we go back to the beginning, it's a narrative that's able to deal with horror. It can take it within itself in the manner that God in Christ took into himself what terrified us the most. And it can transmute it, transfigure it, and redeem it.
On that note, Father Steve Grunow, I want to thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you for having me.
For the Word on Fire Institute, I'm Andrew Petiprin.